right, thank you. Welcome, everyone. So we're going to take the next hour and a half talking about corrective action plans, and I want to include also information about preventive action plans. Very often we have pulled this information from manufacturing and quality and a lot of the things that we've seen over the last several years coming from GMP, and we have applied it sort of as a new note to file. And I want to make sure that we really understand that this corrective and preventive action planning is a process. So many of us think of it as I said, a new buzzword, and as an auditor I hear all of these things from folks in terms of, well, we use a CAPA, but they're really just using it as a root cause, or I'm sorry, as a note to file, and not doing a root cause analysis, and not going back and doing an impact assessment or assessing efficacy. As we pull this down, one of the concerns that we have is that people struggle to put plans in place to implement these. Not everything can require a corrective and preventive action plan, because then we're sort of diluting the punch, if you will, of using a corrective and preventive action process. So this comes down to us from manufacturing, as I mentioned early. Michael Maccarelli within CVRH in 2005 said, why do we spend so much time making sure we have well manufactured investigational product, but then we hand it over to GCP, and GMP is very top-down and management-centric, and we're building quality in. Let's take this and use it for GCP. So he said that if you think about it, the two biggest things we can learn from GCP from GMP is having management actively engaged and having that corrective and preventive action plan, having a way to bring ourselves back into compliance, which is what all regulatory bodies are looking for, is that potential for voluntary compliance as a sponsor. So it's great. We have to think about this, because not only are we as a sponsor required to secure compliance from our investigators, but if we're following ICH, we're also required, ICH E6, we're also required to make sure that we are securing compliance from ourselves and our staff. So one of the questions I always like to ask when I'm auditing is, do you have a predetermined noncompliance policy for your investigators? And when I first started asking this question years and years ago, it was one of those things where, yeah, you know, if there's misconduct, we're going to do this, but nothing was laid out uniformly. Nothing really triggered people to say, here's how we're going to bring you back into compliance. And if you fail this, we're going to have to follow that regulatory requirement, which is promptly secure compliance. And if you fail to do so, you have to secure your product, terminate that investigator's participation, and shut you down and report you. So we have to think about noncompliance. How do we define that? One of the things we've done in industry over the last several years is, I don't know if it's to make ourselves feel better or what, for simplicity's sake, we've stopped using the term protocol violations, and we compress protocol deviations and violations into one and stratify them as major and minor. But be mindful that the FDA does not look at it that way. The way the FDA defines a protocol deviation is what we historically in the industry have defined an exception or a waiver. So a limited prospective departure from the protocol that is not intended to be a systematic change, and the other stuff they say is noncompliance. So we find that definition in the FDA's Compliance Program Guidance Manual 7348.811 on how they will conduct an inspection of a clinical investigator site. Are you familiar with those compliance program guidance manuals, how the FDA will go in and perform inspections of sponsors, CROs, monitors, IRBs, and clinical investigator sponsor investigators? Give me a green check, please, if you are, red X if not, and we'll get those out to you. Okay, great. So the one for sponsors, of course, was updated in April of 2017 to include information about the final rule for clinicaltrials.gov. But it has historically talked about, what do you do with investigator sponsors? What do you do with investigators who are not compliant? Who's responsible for this? Is it the sponsor? Is it the CRO? How do you bring that investigator into compliance or pull the trigger on releasing them from your study? So we have to think about, how do we define noncompliance? Who is responsible for developing a corrective action plan? And as we mentioned too, a preventive action plan, because we have CAPA. What we want to make sure is that we are following that, because if we've had a breakdown in one system, there's a potential for breakdown in others, and we'll define that as we go along. Look at the components of corrective action planning and identify examples of corrective actions for different levels of noncompliance.